Hi beekeepers, Aaron King here, Treasurer of Tidewater Beekeepers Association, here to talk to you about feeding your bees. Now I get a lot of questions about feeding bees, but the number one question I get is when is feeding your bees appropriate? And that's really going to depend on what style of beekeeping you're doing. Get yourself a mentor and kind of learn from them and maybe watch some videos or read some books and learn from that as well. I myself will usually feed my bees only when it's necessary, and when it's not necessary, I don't feed my bees. Other people will feed their bees pretty much to the winter, and then some people will feed their bees minus the nectar flow season. So it really is going to depend, but when it is appropriate to feed your bees is when you're establishing a new colony, especially during the dearth, when there is a swarm that needs to be addressed and taken care of. And then when perhaps in the early fall you've done an inspection and you notice that you have low stores and you need to build those stores up before winter. The other time that you would probably introduce feed is if you're trying to introduce some sort of medicinal substance like an antibiotic or even some sort of essential oil to the bees. So those would be usually the appropriate times to do that. The only time that we would not feed our bees is pretty much during the nectar flow if you're harvesting honey. You do not want that sugar syrup to mix with the honey because then it's not real honey. So you would usually not feed them during that time. The other time is when it's too cold to feed them. And we'll get a little bit more into winter feeding later, but if it's too cold, the sugar syrup will either crystallize or freeze and the bees won't be able to get to it anyway. So the first thing we want to talk about is what we're feeding our bees, which is simply just syrup or sugar water as some people would like to call it. In the springtime we do a 1-to-1 ratio, which is 1 part by weight or volume of sugar to 1 part by weight or volume to water. Now I usually do it by weight, lots of people do it by volume. It's up to you how you want to do it. They're very close. In the wintertime, we do 2 parts sugar to 1 part water though, and that's because we want to create a thicker syrup because there's not a lot of time to cure that syrup and the days are shorter. We'll get into winter feeding a little bit later, but that's pretty much what you need to know about that. There's basically 2 ways that you can mix your syrup. One is through heat and one is through agitation. Now, we usually use a combination of both. With heat, the benefit is you don't have to do a lot of agitation. You just simply put the sugar and the water together, you stir on low heat, and you have syrup water really fast. You can even put it in an Instapot, 5-pound bag of sugar, 5 pounds of water, drop it in the Instapot, no stirring required, turn it on low, walk away, come back, and then you have sugar or syrup. The other way to do this is to agitate, which is to stir. We usually stir with a paddle or something, depending on how much you're going to make. If you're going to do like a 5-gallon bucket, you're going to be stirring for a long time, and it's going to be hard to move at first. But eventually, once enough water has coated all of that sugar and is starting to dissolve, it becomes easier and easier to mix. The pros to the heat method is that it's easy and it's faster, but it does break down the sugar molecule. The sucrose will break down into glucose and fructose, not all of it, but some of it. And bees do prefer the sucrose molecule to either of the other 2 molecules. The agitation, it won't break down the molecules, but it is a lot harder to stir depending on the size or the batch of the syrup that you're making. So just keep that in mind. You can let it sit with the sugar for a long time and it will eventually dissolve. But you also have this thing called crystallization that will occur where if you have a seed crystal in your syrup substance, it will eventually start to form more and more crystals. And then you have to agitate it again to break those crystals up into the water. Sometimes people will also put acid in their syrup mixture. This is to lower the pH so that it's easier for the bees to digest. Usually what people will add is ascorbic acid, which is also known as vitamin C. They will add vinegar or they will add lemon juice. And what they're trying to do is get the pH to around 4, which is around the pH of honey, which can be anywhere from 3.5 to 4.5. One of the medicinal agents people will add is a Honeybee Healthy, which is basically 2 essential oils, spearmint and lemongrass, and it's used to quote-unquote stimulate the bees. Now, this is a brand. You can make your own, though. It's considered a stimulant, and it calms the bees and quote-unquote improves health. You can also use other essential oils. Some people use tea tree. Some people use spearmint. We've already talked about lemongrass. Essential oils, they would gather some of these essential oils when they were grabbing, nectar from different plants. There would be some oils in there, and they will be extruded out in their wax and other things, and it will help to improve the overall immunity of the hive. Ascorbic acid is vitamin C, and there are some theories out there saying that helps to improve the overall health of the colony and extends the life of the colony. So again, do your own research. There is a lot of information about what to feed your bees, and lots of people feed their bees different things. So another supplement that people will feed their bees are pollen patties. Now, we were talking about sugar, which is the carbohydrates bees need to live, but they also need protein, which comes from the pollen. Now, in our area, we have so much pollen. I don't know if you've ever seen how yellow it is. That's because 2 allergy zones cross, and this is one of the worst places for allergies in the United States. We have usually enough pollen for bees to gather that we don't need it. But depending on the area that you live, since there could be people watching this from out of state or from the western part of the state, check with your local beekeepers and find out if you need to use pollen patties as a supplement. We don't necessarily need to use them here, but pollen is also another supplement that you can feed your bees. Here in the fall, we change up our ratio of sugar to water to 2 to 1. And the main reason why we do that is because the days get shorter and there's less time to cure that syrup mixture into viable feed for the bees. So in Hampton Roads, we have a fall flow, and if your stores are a little bit low, more than likely your bees will get enough through that fall flow in order to get through the winter. But if you're harvesting honey, you will need to feed them in order to get those stores back. And so you want to start to feed them a 2 to 1 ratio. Well, people ask, well, when should you start to feed them? And I would say the fall equinox is a simple time to remember. That's basically going to be your when your days start to get shorter and shorter and shorter. So remember to change over to a 2 to 1 feed at the fall equinox. So let's talk about going into winter, what you're going to need. You're going to need about 60 pounds of honey on your hive, okay? If you don't have 60 pounds of honey when you've done your fall hive inspections and you've done your mite treatments, then you're going to start to feed them to build up their stores. All right, so let's talk about feeders now. There are different types of feeders. There's a lot of different types of feeders, so I'm just going to go over some basic ones today. The first feeder we have here is the mason jar feeder. This is a very easy feeder to get started with. You can put it at the top of your hive. You can screw it in, and you just let the mason jar of feed kind of sometimes drip, but hopefully the bees will get to it and gather the honey and pull it down. It's a very cheap way to do it. All you need is some mason jars. You need a lid with a hole in it, with holes tapped in it. The bees climb up, they pull down the water, and then they come back down. Okay? It's really easy to use, but even with your larger mason jars, which then get a little more expensive, you're constantly filling them up. Okay? The next feeder, and this is my personal favorite, is the Miller feeder. The Miller feeder is basically just a big tub at the top of your hive that you fill with sugar water, and the bees can climb into it using the screen, They can gather the sugar water and then they can bring it into the hive. There's a lot less drowning with this. I have made some myself, but Miller does make a good product there. They are expensive, but there's a lot less drowning. They're really easy to clean, and you don't have to constantly fill them up. Just know that they can kind of mold. They're kind of covered with beeswax, and you will need to clean them on a regular basis. You will also need to clean your mason jars as well. They'll get moldy. There's also other types of top feeders that aren't the Miller feeder. There's ones with floats where the bees are supposed to float in them, and then you open them up and you find 300 dead bees drowned in your sugar water because the floats got glued to the bottom because it's sugar water that you're putting the floats in. There are also ones where there are no floats. The bees can just kind of get access to it. They're all good. Find one that works for you. I prefer top feeder. I prefer the top feeder as the Miller feeder. There's also a front end feeder, and most people tell you not to get these. Now, I say if it's inexpensive, you can get it if you want, but it does increase robbing, and that's your front feeder. Now, your front feeder is just basically kind of like your mason jar feeder, except it goes into the front entrance. But because it's so close to the front entrance, you have a lot of times, if you have a lot of hives near each other, there's going to be some robbing because other bees will try to get to that sugar water. That can cause issues once they find out that there's a whole hive full of honey right there. So we tend to kind of stay away from the front end feeders. But they're easy to use, they're relatively cheap, and but you kind of have to fill them up all the time, just like your mason jars. And then last but not least is a frame feeder. It's a small container the size of a frame that holds sugar water. They have little floats, or they have little screens that the bees can climb down. I have seen nothing but drowned bees in them myself, so I do not prefer them. They're hard to get to because you have to go into the box. So it's not something that you could feed them if the weather's a little bit cooler. You don't want to open up your hive for some reason. So there's a lot of drawbacks with them, but that is also a way that you can feed your bees from inside the frame. Okay, so now getting into winter. As I already stated, you need about 60 pounds of honey in the Hampton Roads area on your hives. Warm days you can feed throughout the winter with syrup, but you have to worry about a few things. If you're using a mason jar feeder, that sugar water can drip, and it can drip onto the cluster of bees when it's cold at night, and it could kill your colony. So a top feeder of some sort would be preferable in those situations. Secondly, if it's too cold, the temperature drops, that sugar water is going to become very viscous. It'll crystallize, or it'll just freeze because it has water in it. So you're going to have to kind of play that by ear and really only feed them on warm days. And that's even if they decide to break cluster. So there are also some emergency procedures on how to feed your bees during the winter. But I do want to tell you that they are for emergencies only, and you should not be feeding your bees this on a regular basis. You should have already been prepared, and this is now something's gone wrong in your colony, and you're just trying to get them to survive through the winter. So the first thing we're going to talk about is sugar board or sugar cake, which is basically just a little bit of moisture mixed with your sugar, okay, a little bit of vinegar. You stir it up, and then you press them into cakes and put on top of your frames, or you can press them into a whole board that you can put on top of your frames. Now, I usually prefer the cakes, and I'll place them in different frames, like so, and allow the bees to crawl on them. And in a later part of the video, you're gonna see me make those cakes. Another way, what you can do is fondant, which I'll show you how to make, which is more of a pliable mixture of sugar. You're gonna actually candy it. You're gonna get it to the softball stage, and the bees, with either the sugar cake or the fondant, will breathe onto the sugar, and then they will dissolve it with their breath, the moisture in their breath, and then they will absorb the sugar that way. You can also put raw sugar on your frames in a way for the bees to get to it. So we're going to switch over to me messing up my kitchen, making fondant and sugar cake. Thank you. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is make our fondant. We're going to do this on the stove. We're going to need a pan. You're going to need a long metal spoon, and I prefer metal. And the reason why I prefer metal is because it doesn't have as many jagged edges as wooden spoons do, and therefore won't seed your crystals. Don't have to worry too much about seeding your crystals, but as a chef, this is just something that's important to me, so I'm going to make sure that I'm not seeding them. Thus, I use my metal spoon. We also have a thermometer here. This is not a candy thermometer, but it goes up to 400 degrees, so I will use it as a candy thermometer. Please keep in mind safety. I'm cheap, so I'm not going to use a candy thermometer, but they do have shields and very long probes that allow you to test with. But I'm just going to stick mine in a whisk like this to hold it, but more than likely I'm just going to spot check it with my thermometer. The other thing you're going to need is a sheet pan. I put tinfoil on my sheet pan just to keep it clean, as well as a piece of parchment which I'm going to use to basically hold the fondant and wrap it. So we're going to have to start our ignition source first. So put the pan on, start your heat. This can be done on an electric stove as well. Now, as long as I immediately put in the water, I'm not too worried about the heat, okay? But don't leave it on the heat for a long time. Now, that's about 12 ounces of water that I'm adding in, and that will go to my 4 pounds of sugar. Okay, so now I've cleaned up my mess, and what I'm going to do is turn my heat back on and I'm going to start to get this mixture wet. It doesn't have to be fully mixed right now. The key part is to make sure there's no dry sugar on the bottom so it doesn't burn. Basically everything is coated in water. It's thick, it's going to be hard to move, it's very viscous. So if you do this in small batches, unless you have one of those nice copper candy kettles, which none of us have, but you know, you could use. And also make sure that you clean up your mess, because as you can see, I spilled some sugar earlier and now I'm wiping this up. Once that sugar caramelizes onto your stove, it's going to be a lot harder to clean, so clean it up while it's still in a powdered form. I'm going to add just a little bit of vinegar here. Again, a lot of people add vinegar just in the candying process. It helps to lower the pH as well for the bees. So I eyed it, but I think this recipe requires a tablespoon of vinegar. And I just wipe everything, and there's the little piece that, I don't know, probably came from my spoon holder there. And now we're just going to kind of fast forward through this, because this is the process where it heats up. Now, just to explain what's happening here is we are creating a sugar to water ratio based on heat. Okay? So your water boils at 112 degrees normally, depending on atmospheric conditions. So that being said, water doesn't get any hotter than 212 degrees before it turns into steam. So for this mixture to get to 235 degrees, which is where we want it to get to, it has to boil off some of the water. And as it boils off some of the water, the sugar gets hotter, and the syrup mixture or the fondant mixture will get will climb in temperature. As you start to approach, it's kind of like a curve. As you start to approach that 112 degrees and you keep going higher, it's going to kind of escalate. So you want to keep a good eye on that. You don't want it to caramelize. We're not making a caramel for the bees. We're just trying to make a simple softball fondant so the bees have something to eat in case of an emergency. You see those little bubbles forming on the top right there? That's a good sign. That means that we are getting close to our temperature. We can keep checking. If you don't have a thermometer, though, you can start to pour it into cold water. Pour a little bit of the sugar syrup into cold water, and if it becomes kind of a soft string that's pliable with your fingers, you're at that softball stage. We also kind of want the sugar to go clear, and as you can see, it's not clear yet. It's very important for it to go clear because that means that everything has dissolved, and that's basically what you want to see right there. Now this is hot. Now you can do this. You can let this substance cool down, and you can fold it by hand, which a lot of people do. I don't have the patience for it, so I'm going to take this syrup mixture, as hot as it is, and I'm going to pour it into my stand mixer. And then I'm going to let the temperature drop a little bit more, maybe to about 130 degrees, 150 degrees, somewhere around there. So I'm just going to let it cool. Once I let it cool, I'm going to start my mixer. Basically, what I'm doing now is I'm incorporating a lot of air into my fondant, and I'm also kind of forming these long chains of sugar. Because it's at the softball stage, it's going to kind of be pliable sugar. Okay, so here is where we're going to be with our fondant. As you can see, it's kind of dripping. It's white. It's full of air, and it's soft. We're just going to dump this onto our sheet pan with the parchment paper right there, and go from there. Alright, so this is basically what it looks like. You could cut it up into chunks. You could put this whole chunk right on top of your frames too. Normally what I would do is I would cut them up and then individually wrap them. But again, I don't usually feed my bees for emergencies because I usually make sure they have enough honey on the hive to go through the winter. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is the sugar cakes. That's what I like to call them. Some people call it candy board, but then some people also call a different version candy board. So I just call it sugar cakes because basically I'm making sandcastles out of sugar. So the first thing you're going to need is a nice bowl. We don't need any heat for this, but I'm going to do this over my stove because it's easy to clean. So as you can see, I'm not struggling as much with the sugar this time, and I'm just going to dump it into my bowl here. Perfect. I'm going to add very little water to the sugar, less than a cup, about 3/4 of a cup. You could even go even less if you'd like to start off with less, maybe a half a cup. You're just trying to get the sugar to a sandcastle-like consistency. So you're going to need to kind of move it around so that those sugar crystals are all coated in a little bit of moisture. Now, this is difficult to move around. It's not as difficult as, let's say, 10 pounds of sugar. But I do recommend that you you do this in small batches so that you're not straining your arms. I'm also adding vinegar again. This again will lower the pH for the bees as well as help everything stick together. So this is where I'm just going to kind of mix stuff around. Alright, this is about where we want it. Notice when I push it down, it works. And you basically make your cakes. You can do it in a mold, like so. You could also just use your sheet pan as your mold. I like to be fancy with my copper mold here. And I'm going to push everything down. Just like so. Push it down, flatten it out. And that's pretty much how you make your cake. You just let these dry and then put them on the beehive frames. That's it.